Good to see you both. You both obviously sat through that hour or so long press conference. Kieran, firstly to you, the Prime Minister was pointing to the times. We knew they were unusual. The pandemic, we all understand, was an extraordinary time to be in government, and as the former Prime Minister described, it was a difficult time. Again and again, he argued these were emergency powers. They were there in reserve capacity. While he apologised to his colleagues for not keeping them in the loop, he described his actions as prudent, responsible actions, saying that he believed at the time they were needed to ensure that he could carry out his responsibilities as Prime Minister. With that extra context, what did you make of his performance? Do you think his justification stacks up?
There are still some really big problems with the whole explanation here, Ashley, and a few contradictions along the way as well. He's trying to give his best explanation as to what went on, why things maybe were messy, why some colleagues were told and others weren't. But in that circumstance, he apologised to Matthias Cormann. He said he should have been told. In the other circumstances, he says, well, I chose not to tell them because I didn't want them looking over their shoulder. So which was it? The whole thing about not remembering requesting the Treasury portfolio, as he calls it, administrative swearing in. Yesterday, when he was asked, he checked with the department and subsequently, yes, he was sworn in with Treasury Home Affairs. This was an extraordinary news conference, Ashley. Extraordinary to see a former Prime Minister of only a few months ago in this position, embattled, calls for him to step down from Parliament for deceiving his Cabinet colleagues. Karen Andrews leading that call, of course, publicly. Privately, his former Cabinet colleagues, some of them are ropeable. Ropeable that he took the steps, and even more so that he didn't share the information with them when he took those measures. So he wants to try and cool things down. The word you used, defiant, is exactly the right word. I'm not sure it's going to do everything he hopes in terms of calming things down, because this is, from a constitutional perspective, unprecedented, a political perspective, also something that I have not seen in my time covering politics. It's extraordinary to see a former Prime Minister so soon after being deposed under so much pressure for decisions made while in that office.
Paul, as you wrote today, it is the secrecy that is baffling. At the core of this saga is the deception, the lack of disclosure by Mr Morrison that is a big problem. We heard Mr Morrison asked in that news conference, why didn't you tell the Australian people? And he said he was essentially worried that these powers would be, in his words, misinterpreted and misunderstood. How did you rate that explanation for what is such a strange move?
Well, I think the point about secrecy is absolutely critical here. And this is the fundamental reason why Scott Morrison's in so much trouble. And the great paradox of this is that he commissioned himself into these other portfolios. He didn't tell the ministers, so that is a breach of trust. It's a breach of confidence. It's one of the reasons why his former colleagues are so angry with him. But of course, if he had told them, it's most unlikely the entire project would have proceeded, because people wouldn't have accepted it. Now, the actual explanation that he gave for keeping it secret, that is, that it would have destabilised public administration, that would have confused people. Well, the point about that is that highlights the fact, I think, that this was an unsatisfactory course of action. Scott Morrison argued today, and I think it was important that he had the press conference, important that he stated his case. He talked about the difficulties in managing the country during the pandemic. All that's well and good. He made the point that what he did was legal and constitutional, and presumably the Solicitor General will verify that next Monday, but that's a particularly important point. But where I think he was particularly weak was actually giving a concrete explanation for why he'd done this. I understand him swearing himself in as Health Minister at the start of the pandemic. That is a separate case where Greg Hunt and Christian Porter were involved in that, and that was a problem with the Biosecurity Act. But I think the former Prime Minister was particularly weak in explaining why he had to be sworn in and have commissioning power in relation to those other portfolios.
Kieran, when it comes to Mr Morrison's colleagues, he said that the fact they didn't know that he'd taken on these responsibilities was proof of his lack of interference. He says he was only ever going to use them in an emergency situation. As you mentioned earlier, his colleagues are furious. One former cabinet minister I spoke with yesterday was just gobsmacked that these developments had been revealed. Today, though, we heard in that news conference, Mr Morrison said that he had had a wonderful conversation, in his words, with the former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, who we know was also kept in the dark about all of this, along with the former Home Affairs Minister Kieran Andrews, who is the person who has been calling on him to resign. But as Mr Morrison noted, that call hasn't been echoed by other senior Liberals, and he clearly intends to stay in the Parliament. In terms of who did know, Mr Morrison wasn't overly keen to go into any details in terms of his communications with the Governor-General. We are going to expect to see more focus in terms of what the Governor-General's role was in all of this.
Yeah, there's absolutely, and I think those questions were the key. What was said by the Governor-General to the Prime Minister and staff at the time in terms of warnings? Were there warnings about the need to make this public, to declare them to the Parliament? But where Paul suggested that the former Prime Minister was weak, I absolutely agree. I think it's a gaping hole in his explanation here. I listened very closely, as you would have at home as well, and I'm trying to think where was the reasoning for taking Treasury 5 days before the budget of last year? Where was the explanation for Home Affairs, except for that sort of bureaucratic reasoning that he says they are departments where ministers can make decisions separate to Cabinet, not dependent on Cabinet rulings? That's fine, but that's been the case for many a year, not just in a pandemic. So I just did not see the rationalising of that decision at all. I think it's a gaping hole in those moves. And then further to the gas decision, that is a completely removed judgment. He's used these powers he realised he had to overrule a gas licence, the PEP 11 project as it's called, nothing to do with the pandemic, using this power to do so. Whether you like the project or not, it's not a precedent with which our system is designed to encourage, and the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, was certainly under the pump in trying to justify that one as well. But as for that wonderful conversation with Josh Frydenberg, Ash, my understanding is the former Treasurer is absolutely furious. He was the former Deputy Liberal leader at the time. He lived with Scott Morrison at the Lodge. The fact that he wasn't given a heads up is beyond belief.
I agree with you. It is absolutely extraordinary that those closest to him in terms of cabinet colleagues were left in the dark. Paul, you have seen Prime Ministers come and go. You've seen many a government face crisis after crisis. Yes, the pandemic was unprecedented. We all acknowledge that. But in terms of what this does to Scott Morrison's legacy, where it leaves politically now, the Liberals, his former colleagues, how damaging do you see this saga going forward?
I think that it will damage Scott Morrison's legacy. Look, this whole situation is just weird. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. And the point is, it was unnecessary. Apart from being sworn in as Health Minister, all the rest was unnecessary. And Scott Morrison can't provide a persuasive argument as to why he did it. And frankly, when it comes to these other ministers, it's very hard not to conclude, and I'm certain that they do, that there's a lack of confidence here on the part of Scott Morrison towards these ministers. And this is particularly pertinent when it comes to the Treasurer, the Deputy Leader, someone he had a very close relationship with, Josh Frydenberg. And how do we think Frydenberg feels, given that Frydenberg was approached by Liberals at the end of last year, urging him to challenge the Prime Minister, given the Prime Minister was so unpopular? Frydenberg didn't do that. He stayed loyal, and now he finds that for the previous 12 months, he had the Prime Minister was also commissioned as Treasurer as well as himself. I mean, the only conclusion that he would draw from that is there's a lack of trust and there was a lack of confidence from Scott Morrison towards Frydenberg as Treasurer and Deputy Leader. And that's how other ministers feel. And it comes back to this fundamental point. This was an unwise decision for Scott Morrison to take. And the potential benefits are completely outweighed by the damage that's been done. In terms of damage to conventions, damage to ministerial responsibility, damage to the quality of personal and political relationships between Scott Morrison and his senior ministers. And what will happen now is there'll be ongoing brand damage being done to the Morrison government, and we can be absolutely certain that Anthony Albanese will ram that home.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point, isn't it, Kieran, that this is such a gift to the Albanese government, the political judgment clearly missing when Scott Morrison was making these decisions. What does the government now learn from this saga in terms of areas of possible reform? Do you think, Kieran, that it's clear to you that we need changes to prevent this from being able to happen again?
Well, ministers do share portfolios. There are overlapping responsibilities. That's all fine. That will continue. What needs to happen, Ash, and I think before the inquiry's held, it's pretty clear that whenever there is a ministerial portfolio change or ministerial arrangements change, it needs to be declared publicly and tabled in the Parliament. I actually thought that was already the case. Clearly it's not, given the episode we've just seen. This is a no-brainer for some reform that will preclude this thing from ever happening again. But on the Labor Party approach, I think Mr Albanese and Jim Chalmers and others have handled it absolutely appropriately thus far. The one thing I would say, though, is if you're Prime Minister Albanese, I would be getting others like the Attorney-General and others to take up the mantle, so to speak. If he wants to make a point from time to time, fine, but he needs to get back as quickly as possible to his main message on jobs and improving cost of living arrangements for Australians. That's where his head needs to be. Fine, I totally understand the opening response and opening salvo, yes, but in a political sense, you don't want comments like John Howard's of the last 24 hours where he said Mr Albanese sounds like an opposition leader. You don't want those to take hold. He does not want, and to be honest, this is a controversy that speaks for itself. He doesn't have to.
Paul, would you agree with that? What's your take on the handling of this saga by Mr Albanese and his colleagues? And when it does come to the gaps that Scott Morrison alluded to, he said the system was put under the microscope and strain. There were gaps in the system. Is there anything else in terms of the gaps that you think need to be fixed now?
Well, this is going to be a bit of a test of the Albanese government. I'm not quite certain where Anthony Albanese is going to take this entire issue. What does he hope to get out of this? It's one thing to establish the facts. OK, we'll have a legal opinion from the Solicitor General next Monday. What happens after this? We've had Labor ministers say that they don't believe that Scott Morrison took only one decision, that is the resources decision. So I can understand we need to clarify whether that's the situation or not. But the big question is, how does Anthony Albanese intend to proceed with this? I'd like to know what he thinks of the Biosecurity Act. The Biosecurity Act and the defects in that act are the trigger for all these events. Because essentially what happened was that when Scott Morrison, Greg Hunt and Christian Porter addressed what they had to do with the Biosecurity Act and came up with the solution of commissioning Scott Morrison also as Health Minister, and I think there was a justification for that. What happened then was that Morrison used this model for another 4 portfolios, which I think was not justified. Well, Anthony Albanese is now the Prime Minister. Is he happy with the Biosecurity Act? If he faces some sort of new pandemic, what would he do in terms of responding if the Biosecurity Act emergency provisions need to be invoked? So I think that there are issues we want to hear from Labor about as well when it comes to this question.